I actually got a promotion finally. So. Yeah, I actually got a promotion finally. So. Got a little bit more money.
Oh, great. All right, Chris Speaks here tonight with Dr. Lucas Wilder, the man himself. Dr. Lucas Wilder, the man himself. Always looking forward to these bi-weekly or monthly chats. And tonight we're going to talk about a Civil War general that everybody has heard of, but nobody knows a lot about. Lucas, my man, how are you?
Chris, I am doing just fine. I'm excited to talk about this wonderful Civil War character, and I've been doing a series over him for the last couple of weeks, and I thought, what better way to get more people to understand this sometimes enigma of the Civil War than talk to you about him.
Well, what kind of man was A.P. Hill?
A.P. Hill was, from all accounts and all the records you can read about him, he's a very kind person, and he always tried to do what was right. I mean, he was born and raised in Culpeper, Virginia. His family had been in Culpeper, although they had been there quite a while. It wasn't that he came from an affluent family. I mean, they did well, but they weren't rich, as just regular people. One of his ancestors, I might get the number wrong, but I think it was his great grandfather was actually the first person to explore the valley that I live in right now, born and raised in the Powell Valley. Ambrose Powell, and that's who he was named after, was his great grandfather. Like I said, who was a somewhat of an explorer and a frontiersman at the very least.
Interesting.
Yeah. A.P. Hill, so his family had been in Virginia for quite a while, and like many of the Civil War generals, you have this wonderful ties to Virginia. A.P. Hill will go to West Point and do decent in his first couple of years, but when after a little while, you do finally get to go on furlough and get to go home, but for that first year, you cannot go home. So he had to go through an entire year. When he goes on furlough, all the people at West Point, all the teachers, all the professors, superintendent, was like, do not go to those houses of ill repute in New York City. And apparently he does take a dalliance over into New York City. I think it's on his way back to West Point after he's went and seen his family. We don't know where he went, but we do know he caught a venereal disease. It was gonorrhea. That is something that will plague him the rest of his life. It's not that he got gonorrhea. It turns into prostatitis and eventually turns into uremia, where his kidneys are being affected. I mean, it very much hampers him. We'll talk about that and not too far away, a few more minutes. So he will contract that at West Point, or when he's at West Point. Also, A.P. Hill, so he actually has to skip a year. He spends a year out of West Point because he's so sick he has to go back home, but they allow him to come back into West Point. So he's a year behind than when he's normally supposed to go. And he was supposed to graduate when the Mexican-American War breaks out. And so he has to watch some of his best friends march off to war, knowing that he's going to miss out on this way to achieve glory. And he's been training for this for so many years at West Point. Now he's going to miss out on the America's war. Can he get there before the war ends? He will eventually do that, but he does meet a very good friend. And this man has came up in other biographies I've done, and most prominently in Winfield Scott Hancock's biography. Winfield Scott Hancock and Henry Heath were very good friends, and A.P. Hill and Henry Heath become good friends at West Point. They actually are they were some of the West Point cadets around Christmas time are supposed to be invited to a kind of an overall party. The upperclassmen are supposed to, upperclass officers are supposed to be given the opportunity to go to a party held by the superintendent of West Point and some of the professors, but they are not allowed to come that year. And so A.P. Hill and Henry Heath and a few others resort to actually crashing their party by stealing the food that was supposed to be there for that banquet that night, including the and it's kind of funny. A.P. Hill, as far as we know, didn't have anything to do with stealing the turkey part of the situation, but Henry Heath, there's a man in Henry Heath go to steal the turkey. The gentleman hits the cook from behind. The turkey goes flying, and Henry Heath catches it almost like an interception. It's a wonderful catch on the part of Henry Heath. And they take it back, and A.P. Hill and Henry Heath say that they never enjoyed a turkey so much as when they got it from the West Point mess hall. So they had a pretty good time at West Point. But once their fun and games were over with, A.P. Hill does graduate with enough time to go fight in the Mexican-American War. The war is not over yet. He does join Winfield Scott on his march to Mexico City, and A.P. Hill will do a pretty good job. He's a very strict disciplinarian, especially these volunteers who are coming into the Army are not used to military protocol. They're not used to being in the military and having so much regulation put on them. And one town that is taken over in Mexico, A.P. Hill will have to reprimand and start actually beating volunteers, like to keep them from stealing from the public, stealing from the Mexican citizens, and committing other atrocities. So he's a very strict disciplinarian, especially when it comes to military etiquette and protocol and the way that you should conduct yourself as a soldier. He'll take part in some battles, but nothing too spectacular. It's not like you have many of these Civil War generals like Ulysses S. Grant and Longstreet leading these charges in the Mexican-American War. A.P. Hill is in the artillery for one, and so he's not making these grandiose charges, but he's definitely a very influential person during the Mexican-American War, even though he doesn't take any prominent role. After the Mexican-American War, like many soldiers, and to the detriment of A.P. Hill, he has to spend time in Florida. I have yet to run across any Civil War general who has enjoyed his time in Florida. It's not the vacation destination that we know of today. Florida is a mosquito-infested swamp, and when you're down there, you're having to fight Seminole Indians most of the time. And so A.P. Hill is not enjoying himself there. He will actually contract a couple more diseases, which just exacerbates his gonorrhea, which again has turned into prostatitis, which just puts him into debilitating groin pain. It's a miserable time for A.P. Hill. But A.P. Hill will meet someone in Florida named John Schofield. Now, we know John Schofield probably from one of his last campaigns he takes part in, which is the Battle of Franklin during the American Civil War. But him and A.P. Hill and John Schofield will get to know one another in Florida when both of them come down with a fever from one of the many mosquito bites that they received down there. And John Schofield will spend time at A.P. Hill's home because each one takes turns doctoring the other. If one gets really bad off sick, A.P. Hill will take care of John Schofield. If John Schofield gets sick, or A.P. Hill gets sick, John Schofield will take care of him. So they just kind of trade off. And when they get to A.P. Hill's home, John Schofield is the worst for wear, and so he actually spends time in the Hill home, and has a pretty good time from what John Schofield said. So I love those little personal connections, and that's something you get with the Civil War because they're fighting one another, but they've known each other for so long. You have these wonderful personal connections with, Hill and Hill and Henry Heath. You've got Hill and John Schofield so far. These men knew each other fairly intimately before the American Civil War breaks out. Hill will kind of will travel around in the military, mostly staying around Florida, though, until he finally secures him a way to get to the survey office in Washington, D.C. And that's where he'll spend the majority of his, well, I won't say majority, he'll spend most of his time in the survey office, and where he will be when the Civil War breaks out. But before he makes it there, he's in kind of a contest with one of his friends from one of his good friends, whose name is George McClellan. We know him from the first couple of years of the war and from running against Abraham Lincoln during the 1864 election. But A.P. Hill and George McClellan were very, very good friends.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yes, they both had an eye for the same girl. Her name was Nellie, and Nellie's father was an Army officer, and Nellie's father did not want her to marry anyone in the Army because he knew it's not the best pay, and are you really going to succeed in rising up in rank? Probably not. It's a very small army, barely 16,000 men. A war is going to have to break out to be able to rise up, and then that leads to danger. It's not the best situation. So poor old Nellie is kind of caught between two men. She does like George, but she's in love with A.P. Hill. And A.P. Hill and her are engaged, but her parents will get her to break up the engagement with him. Somehow, it's A.P. Hill. Nellie's mother will hear about A.P. Hill's ailment, we'll say, that he received at West Point. And she'll mention it to Nellie and say that you can't reasonably think of marrying a man who's had such a disease. Don't think of what he's done before. And they will convince her to break off the engagement with A.P. Hill, and she will eventually marry George McClellan. And that comes down the line, but her first love was A.P. Hill, but A.P. Hill and George McClellan both fought over her affections at one point, and McClellan eventually won with the help of her mother and father. This does not make any bitterness between the two men. There is a Civil War myth that on the peninsula, when A.P. Hill is simply a brigadier general and George McClellan is the commander of the Army of the Potomac, and they're working their way up the peninsula, that whenever McClellan's troops are nearby, A.P. Hill is kind of chomping at the bit, ready to hit them as hard as he can. And a Union soldier hears that A.P. Hill is attacking them and says, "Nellie, why didn't you just marry the man?" Because A.P. Hill is just so overcome with anger for losing poor Nellie that he wants to attack McClellan at all costs. That is nothing close to the truth. But that's a little myth that's kind of run rampant through the Civil War. It's actually asked by a veteran. I think it's a veteran asked George McClellan about the situation with A.P. Hill, and he said there's no better soldier of the Civil War than A.P. Hill. And so that shows you how much they actually still had respect for one another. And when A.P. Hill does get married, he gets married to a Lexington elite woman named Dolly Morgan. And Dolly Morgan's brother is named John Hunt Morgan. Of course, they do not know that all these people are going to be very prominent in just a couple of years, because A.P. Hill gets married fairly late in life. Dolly is a widow even at that point. She has lost a husband already when he marries Dolly Morgan. A.P. Hill will invite George McClellan to his wedding, so you can't be too heartbroken if he invites him to his wedding. And McClellan's unable to attend, so the best man of his wedding is John Hunt Morgan. They get married in Lexington, Kentucky. And when George McClellan gets married, A.P. Hill will be one of his groomsmen. So again, that idea that A.P. Hill and McClellan had a bitter feud all the way through the Civil War is just a complete myth. But A.P. Hill...
It's an interesting story.
Oh, yeah. And again, these personal connections are beautiful. I think that's what makes the Civil War so intriguing, is that you have all these connections. But A.P. Hill... Yeah. Dolly and A.P. Hill, from all appearances, has a wonderful marriage. And when the Civil War breaks out, not long after they get married, the A.P. Hill will be in the Coast Survey office, and he's worried that if he stays in the Union Army, he'll be forced to fight Virginia. And that's one of his main concerns from all of his letters home, his letters to friends. That's what he's most worried about, is that if he stays in the Union Army, he will be forced to fight, be forced to just simply fight. He can't just stay in the survey office, which he probably wouldn't see combat if he did. So that's enough to convince him. When Virginia secedes, he actually, before Virginia secedes, he leaves just because he's that scared that it will happen. So even before Virginia secedes, he resigns from the army and joins Virginia. He stays in Culpeper to kind of see what's going to happen in Virginia. Eventually, it does secede, and he throws his lot in with the state of Virginia and eventually the Confederacy. One of his first tasks is being up near Harper's Ferry. That's also where he'll first meet Stonewall Jackson. Of course, Stonewall is not Stonewall at that moment. For that first few months of the Civil War, A.P. Hill has a hard time finding battle. He's either gets incapacitated with his prostatitis, or he gets left out of battles entirely. It's like at First Manassas, his troops are sent to Manassas, but his is kept in reserve and sent to a location where he sees no action on the battlefield. So, I mean, he's chomping at the bit to get to fight, because he spent his lifetime in the Army. He's had an Army career. He thinks he should be a little bit higher up. He's just simply a colonel, but he finally will become a brigadier general. Once he moves south to Richmond, when McClellan goes onto the peninsula, there's all these troops moving into Virginia, and A.P. Hill, between First Manassas and so it's almost a year, but he eventually becomes a brigadier general, and he'll fight on the peninsula against George McClellan with a brigade. And some of the reports from his brigade, the regiments in his brigade, talk about how tenaciously he fights. You know, he hasn't adopted the battle shirt just yet, although he does wear a calico shirt just in his downtime. He hasn't adopted that battle shirt because on the peninsula he's wearing an actual uniform now. Whether it's a complete regulation uniform, you're an officer, or if you're a general, you can kind of choose your uniform. But he's got like a sprig of pine in his hat. He's leading his men with a pistol. I mean, he's always at the front of his brigade, just a very tough fighter, and that goes throughout the entire war. He'll be a tough fighter. He's with the Confederate Army when they get pushed all the way back to Richmond, and that's when he kind of catches the break. A.P. Hill will catch a break when McClellan gets to the gates of Richmond. The entire Confederacy is like, holy crap, they're going to be taking over the capital. We need to rush as many troops as possible to Richmond. So they start flooding Richmond with all these troops. And General Joseph E. Johnston, who's the commander of the Confederate Army there around Richmond, is like, there's just too many troops. I need more division commanders. And A.P. Hill is chosen as one of those division commanders in the what will become the Army of Northern Virginia. It's still the Army of the Potomac at this point, which gets very complicated because now there's two Army of the Potomacs fighting one another. One's Confederate, Union. Anyway, A.P. Hill, by virtue of just so many troops coming in, he's outdone himself militarily on the peninsula, and so now he will be put up to a division command, and it's one of the largest divisions in the Confederate Army. And it's during the next campaign, the 7 Days campaign, that he will call his brigade the Light Division. Now, we have no idea what exactly or why he gave his division that nickname. It's definitely not light. It's one of the biggest divisions in the entire Confederate Army. So it's not because there's too few troops. One of his soldiers admits that they hardly ever get to eat. So they're very light themselves. And so that might be why it's called the Light Division. But don't really know. It just appears on one of his dispatches, and it goes from there. And we always hear the Light Division. And one historian does hypothesize that because they can move very quickly, even though they're so large, they are called the Light Division because of that. That's a possibility, but we'll never completely know. He was never asked and never divulged before he passed away. Anyway, during the 7 Days campaign, we see some things that'll bother A.P. Hill on into the Civil War. One of them is he has problems with Jackson almost immediately. Stonewall Jackson, it just comes in from the Valley during the 7 Days campaign. Joseph E. Johnston has been wounded, so Robert E. Lee is now in the command of the Confederate Army that will become the Army of Northern Virginia. And Jackson has gained great fame during the Shenandoah Valley campaign. He moves to Richmond to help Robert E. Lee fight back McClellan off the gates of Richmond. And so he comes in with huge fanfare. And Jackson is supposed to attack at a certain time. This is around Mechanicsville, Virginia. And A.P. Hill waits, and he waits, and he waits for attack because when Stonewall attacks, he's supposed to start attacking, and they're supposed to kind of have almost a pincer-like movement against the Union right flank. And A.P. Hill never gets that signal. And so he goes in and attacks anyway. It turns into somewhat of a success until he runs into some heavy fortifications and gets pushed back pretty bloodily in a very bloody battle. But he waited for Jackson. Jackson didn't show up. So McClellan is so almost timid, but also feels he is outnumbered, that he will pull back his right flank. And so Robert E. Lee decides he's going to attack again. This time, again, Stonewall is supposed to attack, along with A.P. Hill is going to attack again. Hill waits, and he waits. No one attacks. So A.P. Hill will attack again. And again, because he's not supported, he will be he'll mostly be thrown back. He'll break through the Union line, and this continues, and it seems like it's common. He's always in the right spot, yet Jackson and eventually Longstreet will either delay or be late getting to the location, and it costs his men a lot of lives. I mean, his division is huge, and he'll lose close to half his men during that one campaign. So, wow. That's something that eats away at him, and he's always really anxious when it comes to time. And we'll see that once we get about another year later from this. This is, of course, in the summer of 1861. Do you have any questions so far?
Just do you know why he picked that red sachet to wear?
The red battle shirt. Yeah. Not sure why he. I don't think anyone's ever explained why he specifically wore that. But again, generals can wear any kind of uniform they want to. That's kind of the general. And
I often wondered why he picked that.
I mean, he would wear a uniform occasionally, but usually when there was battle going on, some have speculated it allowed his men to identify him real easily, and that's always a good thing when you're on the battlefield. And we've talked about it on many of our discussions before of making sure that you are identified, and so your men know you're on the field, and that inspires confidence in them. That's probably one of the reasons why. But he would either wear one of his red shirts, or he had what was called a calico shirt. And Dolly always made those for him, and so she would send them to him.
Okay. That's all I had so far. I was just that was in the back of my mind. I didn't want to forget it.
Oh, no problem. But so Robert E. Lee will push McClellan back off the peninsula. A.P. Hill has contributed a lot of manpower towards that push off the peninsula. And once McClellan is gone from the gates of Richmond, his division will be assigned to Stonewall Jackson's wing of the army. And they're going to be campaigning against John Pope, who's up in Northern Virginia, around the Culpeper area at the moment, a little bit north of the Culpeper area. And this is where some of Stonewall and A.P. Hill's headbutting comes into play. I don't think they ever truly get along, although by the end of at the end of Stonewall's life, him and A.P. Hill will have at least some kind of I won't say friendship, but some kind of an understanding with one another.
Okay.
Stonewall I think everybody's aware that he kept his orders to himself. He does not like to divulge his battle plans to anyone else. He wants himself to know, and he's just going to tell you the place to go to. And as they're moving up into central Virginia, northern central Virginia, A.P. Hill will be given orders from Stonewall, and sometimes not given orders, like adjutants just don't find him and give him the message, and Jackson will hold it against A.P. Hill for not having his men up and ready. And some of it is completely Hill's fault. He's not ready when Jackson wants him to move. On one occasion, he's supposed to move at dawn. He doesn't get moving until a couple hours later, which is kind of odd that, he's a stickler for time, but sometimes he's not able to do so. And so that starts rubbing the two men a little bit raw between one another. And this will just exacerbate. It continues on and on and on. And Jackson will I think it might have been at least on one occasion will have him arrested for basically insubordination. But that's closer to Antietam when he's finally allowed to take back command of the Light Division. But anyway, as they're moving through central Virginia, they fight the Second Battle of Manassas. A.P. Hill's division of I keep saying Andrew Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson's wing of the Army of Northern Virginia will take the brunt of the attack at Second Manassas, but he's responsible for holding off Pope's attacks against Stonewall's line at Second Manassas. So if it wasn't for Hill and specifically his South Carolinians under General Maxcy Gregg, Jackson would not have been able to withstand the attacks by John Pope at Second Manassas. After that victory, Lee determines he's going to invade the North. And as they're going to be moving up into Maryland, more problems occur. For one thing, as Jackson's men are stationed at these, as you're moving through the landscape and the terrain, you're going to be running into houses and you'll be camping around very nice homes sometimes. Jackson knows a family, and he orders his men do not burn their split rail fences for warmth or anything. Well, Gregg's South Carolinians do. So they will go against Jackson's orders, and because those South Carolinians are under Hill's discretion, it's because it's Hill's fault by proxy. All of Gregg's colonels will be arrested for their insubordination against Jackson's orders, and eventually Hill will be placed under arrest and taken out of command of the Light Division. So when they go into Maryland, Hill isn't at the lead of his column. He's actually walking behind his men under arrest when they're going into Maryland.
Wow.
Yeah, so he's not even in command of his Light Division when they go into Maryland. Jackson is tasked with capturing Harper's Ferry, and A.P. Hill will go and petition Jackson and say, I know there's a battle coming up. I want to be in charge of my men. You can take me right back out of command of this Light Division once the battle's over with, but I think I need to be in command of the division. Jackson agrees. They capture Harper's Ferry, and it's Hill's Light Division that are kept at Harper's Ferry. The rest of Jackson's wing of the Army of Northern Virginia, I keep wanting to say corps, it's not a corps yet. His wing of the Army of Northern Virginia will march towards the battle that will be at Antietam. It will be at Antietam where Hill will probably get the greatest renown, is when right as the Union are getting ready to push back Robert E. Lee's left flank they've crossed Burnside Bridge. It looks like Lee's army is nearly going to be destroyed. A.P. Hill has conducted a 17-mile march from Harper's Ferry to get to the battlefield. And he could have taken a 12-mile route, would have brought him there quicker, but for some reason he does not take the shorter route. We assume that because he knows there's a battle, that road may have taken him a little bit too close to the Union Army than he would have liked, and that would have stalled him. So he's betting that the longer route may be a little bit more advantageous for him. It works out perfect. On this route, I'll give you a little story as they're crossing rivers and streams. One of his teamsters he stops his men for a little bit. Himself personally, his horse to drink out of a creek, and they're driving these horses very hard because again they're trying to get to Lee's army. Lee has asked for Hill to come to him from Harper's Ferry, and Hill is trying to get there as quickly as possible. But of course, you need to water your horses, and so he's sitting there watering his horse in his calico shirt, and I think he was wearing a calico shirt at that point. And a teamster, so a man who's driving horses in a wagon across, can't get his horses to move. They're wanting to drink, and he's not wanting to let them. And he starts, hurting the horses, whipping them. And A.P. Hill says, "Stop and let the horses drink." Well, the man who's operating the horses does not know who A.P. Hill is. He's not wearing any rank. He's not wearing any insignia. And the teamster basically tells him, "You mind your own business." And the next thing that man knows is A.P. Hill has used the flat side of his sword to crack him across the shoulder blades, and he never forgot who A.P. Hill was after that. Anyway, as Lee's right flank is crumbling, A.P. Hill will make it to the battlefield again. A crazy 17-mile march. His men rush in the battle, able to throw Ambrose Burnside back and save the day for the Confederacy. After the battle, one of his soldiers asks A.P. Hill, like, "Do you know Ambrose Burnside, the man that you threw back at the bridge?" He says, let's see, I'm trying to remember how he words it. Of course I know him. He owes me $8,000. And he did. He had borrowed $8,000 from A.P. Hill and had yet to pay it back, and never did. So they even knew each other, although all the details, I don't know if everybody knows all the details of what happened between him and Ambrose Burnside. But yes, they did know one another. After that, Jackson is, Robert E. Lee's army moves back down into Virginia. It takes a while for McClellan to move his army. Of course, he doesn't move it. It will be put under the command of Ambrose Burnside, the man who A.P. Hill has just thrown back. And at the Battle of Fredericksburg, around that time, right before the battle actually takes place, A.P. Hill loses one of his daughters. He had two daughters, and he loses one of them. And so we assume that that's probably the reason for the mistake he makes at Fredericksburg. He loses he's in a depression. He's kind of distraught. He's asked to place his men on the right of the Confederate Army on Prospect Hill, and he leaves a huge gap in the line. Now, whether whose exact fault it was, a division commander can only be so many places. His brigade commander should have notified him that there was a gap in their line, and some say they did notify him. We'll never exactly know. Even Jeb Stuart said that he reported to A.P. Hill that there was a gap in his line, that he should close it up. He never did, and it was at that point that the Union Army broke through the Confederate line at that gap. And it was just lucky enough that the Stonewall Jackson was able to plug that hole adequately and throw them back. But we think that the reason he made that mistake was because he was distraught over his daughter passing away. So, possibility.
Which Heights did you say it was? Not Mayor's Heights. You said it was which hill? Prospect Hill?
Say that again.
You said it happened on Prospect Hill?
Yeah, Prospect Hill, which was the right flank of the Confederate line.
Yeah, that makes sense. And being all distraught over his daughter.
Yeah, I can imagine that would definitely make you not consider all the aspects of the battle.
Yeah, your mind wouldn't be in the right place. Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Now, it's during this time, right after Fredericksburg, in the winter of 62 to 63, that Jackson and A.P. Hill's feud hits a boiling point, and yet it also cools off at that same moment, which is kind of odd. It's during this point that Jackson will take some umbrage with A.P. Hill's subordinates. And what happens is A.P. Hill and Jackson will order people under their specific command to do things, not going through the proper channels. And each one thinks the other one is breaking military etiquette by going around them. Even Robert E. Lee, when he hears about all this breaking of the chain of command, says, well, if we went through every chain of command, we'd never get anything done. You need to have some leeway with this. And he actually arrests doesn't arrest, he reprimands one of Hill's men in the Signal Corps because some information has been leaked that only A.P. Hill's flag officers would have known. And so Jackson actually interrogates and finds out the culprit who leaked the information that is only supposed to be for the eyes of, the Corps commanders of the Army of Northern Virginia. And it was under A.P. Hill's men. And A.P. Hill, again, takes umbrage at this, thinks that he has been superseded by Stonewall Jackson, and he demands Lee take some kind of action on this. Jackson's actually willing to let the matter go at one point. Lee will set the two men down, discuss things, and it just boils up again. They just never can get this thing handled. And Jackson is willing to let it go, and A.P. Hill says, no, you brought charges against me. If I don't have some kind of trial, then I can't prove my innocence. And that's what his mentality is. And so he's wanting Jackson to bring up all the charges so that he can refute all the charges so that he can be innocent finally. So nothing else can happen about this. Eventually, Robert E. Lee just ignores it. He's not going to deal with it at all. And so by the time the spring of 1863 comes around, and Jackson and Lee and Stuart will formulate what becomes the Battle of Chancellorsville, where Jackson launches his famous flank attack, Hill and Jackson will be on speaking terms, but the feud seems to have cooled off. But you can tell there might be something underneath. But we won't ever find out what happens because Jackson will, of course, be wounded and then eventually die just a few days later in May of 1863.
Now, did Lee already plan on moving them to 3 corps, or did he plan on keeping it at 2?
He said he had his idea about making it to 3 corps previously, but he had not acted on it. Okay. I think it was Jackson and Longstreet were such predominant people. You would hate to have broken up anything that they commanded. So yeah. I think he had it in his mind. At least that's what he kind of that's what Lee gave as the reason. He saw that it was kind of unwieldy to have only 2. He needed to have more commanders to be able to sufficiently block any Union advance wherever he needed to be. But at Chancellorsville, when Joseph Hooker moves across the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers, Jackson will launch his famous flank attack, and he basically has 3 divisions he's going to hit the Union Army with. A.P. Hill's division is in the rear, and Hill's division is literally bringing up the rear. They are the only division in Jackson's corps that will be engaged with Union soldiers on their way to that flank. So they're having to fight, and that's slowing them down. They're not having any huge fights, but they're having to stop. they don't want to show their entire division to them because then they'll know something's up. So they're having to be very strategic about this. And you have to give it to A.P. Hill. He's conducting a really, really great march, but he's being encumbered by all these Union skirmishers coming out and engaging his men. Jackson is running out of daylight. He's not really giving himself enough time. And so he moves Robert Rhodes, General Colston's division, and then A.P. Hill's is supposed to be right behind. A.P. Hill's division is not in line when he launches his flank attack. So the first two divisions are really close together. And what happens is when they hit the Union flank, I believe Robert Rhodes is in front, if I'm not mistaken, Rhodes' men hits the Union line, but because Colston's is so close behind, that creates a traffic jam. And so there's no give, and so troops are getting mashed in between one another. And by the time it's starting to get dark, the battle lines have become so entangled, the only one that's kind of holding its cohesiveness is in Hill's division, because they have yet to really engage anyone, or at least anyone significantly. And Stonewall is urging them to push on to the U.S. Ford across the Rapidan River, that they need to push them on towards there, and if they don't act quickly, they'll regroup. And he's pushing, telling A.P. Hill, and A.P. Hill's men, even in the darkness, are getting mixed around, twisted and turned around. And Hill asked Jackson to let him try to reform his men right quick, and then he'll continue the push. And it's around this time that it's Hill, Jackson, and both their staffs are fired upon in the darkness by a North Carolina unit. Hill is not wounded. When the gunfire goes off, he drops to the ground and waits for waits till all the guns stop firing. So then he gets back on his horse and finds that Jackson has been shot. He will try to go and find help, but eventually will come back to Jackson and will actually cradle Jackson's head in his lap. And so these men who have had a bitter rivalry for a year now, it finally comes to Jackson has been seriously wounded, and Hill is protecting him from any enemy fire, artillery fire. And because the Confederates have fired shots in the darkness, the Union are firing as well. They're that close in the battle lines. It's a crossfire that they're in. And it's A.P. Hill that's basically protecting Jackson's body. Jackson will, Jackson will ask AP, AP will ask Jackson, how badly are you wounded? And Jackson says, seriously, I'm afraid. And a surgeon from one of Hill's divisions comes up and is going to look at Jackson as they can. Again, it's dark, but he's going to try to do anything he can. They eventually do get some of the men to stop firing, so they have a brief break in that crossfire. And it's kind of comical, even though it's a very serious situation. He basically whispers to A.P. Hill, is this surgeon any good? And A.P. Hill has to tell him, yes, he's very highly respected, and don't worry, nothing serious will be done until Hunter McGuire, your personal surgeon, comes. So he's just going to look at you. But I think it's a kind of funny moment and a very dramatic moment of, is this surgeon any good? So anyway. Anyway,
we cut tape. I'll tell you a funny story, something along those lines. But go ahead.
Anyway, they eventually get Jackson, and they're moving him. They move him to safety, and again, they're right in between the lines, and so artillery and rifle fire is going off. And A.P. Hill is actually struck in the back of the leg with a piece of artillery shell. It's odd. He's actually walking at this point when he gets hit, and he can walk for a few steps, and then he realizes it's a very sharp pain. He doesn't think he's wounded. It's just taken off part of his boot. But then as he starts walking, I guess it's the shock and the adrenaline's going, he realizes he has been hit. But he's the commander now. He's the commander of Jackson's Corps. He's the most senior division commander in the Corps. And so he's now the Corps commander. He stays up and stays, cognizant long enough to hand the command of the Corps over to Jeb Stuart. Jeb Stuart and A.P. Hill are actually pretty good friends. There's one thing that Jeb Stuart is, and he's kind of a friend to everybody. I have yet to really know anybody or read about anybody that didn't at least like Jeb Stuart to some extent. And Jeb Stuart and Jackson were good friends, and Jeb Stuart and A.P. Hill were good friends. And Jeb Stuart, A.P. Hill will actually write a letter to Jeb Stuart talking about that. I forget now, how did he phrase it? Talking about that old Presbyterian that he can't wait to get out from under him. And he's talking about Jackson. So Jeb Stuart's kind of the friend in the middle here. Anyway, A.P. Hill will hand over command of the Corps to Jeb Stuart, and the next day, when the battle is to renew, A.P. Hill will follow around Jeb Stuart in basically an ambulance wherever he can. Now, helping Stuart out. Stuart doesn't know the divisions as well as A.P. Hill does, and so he can help Stuart out as much as he can, and then eventually Hill will take back over command of the Corps to send the troops back, or send the Union Army back across the Rapidan. But that is the only serious wound A.P. Hill will get until his death the next year. Any other questions?
No, that was going to be the one that I was going to ask about. Did he get injured anymore? But no, you answered that one. That's kind of amazing, him being in front lines and brigadier colonel, and he only got, well, of course, when they killed him, he only got one minor wound during that time.
Yeah, from the downtime, apparently that wound that he received from the artillery shell wasn't too significant. It did prevent him from walking, and apparently he had to walk, or he had to ride at his horse with his leg kind of stuck out to the side. He couldn't bend it really well until it healed up. But other than that, it wasn't horrible. But it's after the Battle of Chancellorsville, when Jackson is dead. Now Robert E. Lee is going to reorganize the army and turn them into 3 corps. He originally had 2, one under James Longstreet, one under Stonewall Jackson. He will make it into 3, and so he's got James Longstreet. One under Stonewall Jackson. He will make it into 3, and so he's got James Longstreet, and the 2nd Corps commander, who's going to replace Jackson, is not A.P. Hill. He's going to choose Richard Ewell. And Richard Ewell had fought with Jackson in the Valley. He'd got wounded at Second Manassas, where he lost a leg, but he was a fairly respected division commander. And he was named as the 2nd Corps commander. A.P. Hill hears this, and you can... apparently, he seemed a little distraught. He thought he was going to be named Corps commander, but the next day, Robert E. Lee informs him that he is now going to take command of the 3rd Corps, which is brand new. They took pieces of the 1st and 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia and made the 3rd Corps. And who is going to be in A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps? One of his good friends, Henry Heath, is going to be one of his division commanders. So they've known each other real well, and not only is they actually split up the Light Division. The Light Division does not have the same group of brigades that they just originally started out with. When 3rd Corps is created, they actually they actually take 2 brigades out of the Light Division and give them to Henry Heath, and then they have Richard Anderson's division that used to be under Longstreet will come under A.P. Hill at that, and then the person who takes command of the majority of what was left of the Light Division will be Dorsey Pender, which Dorsey Pender and A.P. Hill were fairly good friends. Dorsey Pender was a lot younger than A.P. Hill, but it almost looked at him kind of like a mentor. Pender and A.P. Hill had really similar command styles in that they loved combat. Especially Pender. He was known to be very kind of stoic when he's on the battlefield, just smoking a cigar, watches men go into battle. And it also reminds me of Monty Python at Search for the Holy Grail at Fredericksburg. He'll get wounded in the arm, and his officers are like, "We need to get you help." I mean, his blood is dripping down his fingers. He's like, it's nothing more than a scratch. It's different words than that, but he doesn't really pay much attention to it. So very, very stoic commander is Dorsey Pender.
At Gettysburg, was Hill sick, or was he with his was his brigade just not chosen to make the charge? Because he took he took two divisions from A.P. Hill's corps.
We'll get to there.
Okay.
And I'm glad you brought it up because he does get sick. When he's made corps commander, they leave the next month in June for the invasion of the North, and on his way up there, he does get sick. He's actually at the Cashtown Inn, suffering from his prostatitis, and he's supposed to be sending out basically a reconnaissance mission towards the town of Gettysburg. Now, Jubal Early has just been, his division has already went through that town a day or so prior, and why you're sending, and Hill will send 2 divisions when he's only got 3. He sends 2 divisions toward Gettysburg, but it's actually a good thing he did because he runs into Federal cavalry under John Buford, and then eventually the whole First Corps of the Army of the Potomac will meet him at Gettysburg. But if Hill hadn't have sent 2 divisions on a reconnaissance mission, those under Henry Heath and Dorsey Pender, it might not have worked out that well for the Confederacy of winning so well on the first day. Robert E. Lee is concerned that his corps commanders are fairly new. He's went on a very grandiose campaign with new corps commanders. That's kind of scary. And so when AP, he will meet A.P. Hill at the Cashtown Inn. Again, A.P. Hill suffering from that illness, and he's like, Hill, can you tell me anything about the situation that's developing at Gettysburg? And Hill can only tell him reports because he hasn't been able to go out to the front, but he wills himself to get into the saddle, which only you can imagine with prostatitis and having that groin pain, getting onto a horse would be just miserable. But he gets on the horse and rides with Robert E. Lee to the front, and Lee basically stays by his side the entire first day, making sure that he does everything right. So he's having to guide this corps commander who's new. And a lot of people say that A.P. Hill never achieved, that corps commander style. He wasn't like Jackson. And I would say that's true if you stop at Gettysburg. But as we will see, A.P. Hill gets to be a very dependable corps commander as the war goes on. But now we're jumping ahead at that point. The second day, there is the only role that A.P. Hill is supposed to actually take part in is he's on the second day, he's supposed to wait until Longstreet attacks at what we know as Devil's Den and Little Round Top. Longstreet delays attacking, and A.P. Hill, he's going to use 1 division of his, which is going to be under Richard Anderson's division, to support Longstreet on Longstreet's left. He waits, and he waits, and he waits. What does this sound like? Almost 1 year exactly prior, he's also waiting on Longstreet, who delays and is late coming up during the 7 days battle. Now he's waiting again at Gettysburg for Longstreet to make the attack, but this time A.P. Hill will not attack on his own. He does wait for Longstreet to attack, and when he does, there was a miscommunication. Was A.P. Hill supposed to basically give command of that division to Longstreet, or was he supposed to command it himself? A.P. Hill doesn't give Richard Anderson any specific orders. He kind of gives him an outline, and Anderson will attack, and it's actually Anderson's men, or Ambrose Wright's Georgians, that will make it the furthest and will actually basically do what Pickett's charge was supposed to do. It goes right up the center and takes Cemetery Ridge, but eventually gets pushed back. But again, he's having to wait for Longstreet. Again, this is a recurring theme, and I can almost imagine he's having flashbacks. The third day, when Robert E. Lee is constructing his plan for Pickett's charge, this is when A.P. Hill's kind of left out of it entirely. Lee will tell Longstreet and Hill that he's going to be using both Henry Heath and Dorsey Pender's divisions on the left, so two of the divisions are going to be from Hill's Corps, and Longstreet is going to command one of his divisions. So he's going to have command of three divisions. One of them is going to be his, two of them is going to be from Hill's Corps. Why does he do that? Again, we think that it's because Lee is concerned that A.P. Hill is new at this job. You know, he's going to need a little guidance. Maybe Longstreet should be the one who conducts this attack, which will become Pickett's charge. Apparently, Hill and Longstreet sit and talk for just a few moments, and then they don't talk again the rest of the day. Apparently, Hill thought that Longstreet was supposed to be the overall commander for the attack, which everybody understands that's what he was supposed to be. But Longstreet assumed that A.P. Hill would have some kind of authority over those two divisions and at least help him, but Hill doesn't. Now, again, that's a miscommunication. I don't know. You can't really blame Hill. You probably should have, in all honesty, blame Lee for not making the information clear to both know what you're supposed to be doing. But it is Hill's part of Hill's Corps that breaks first. It's Heath's division. They will break before at Cemetery Hill at the stone wall at Gettysburg, and the battle comes to. The battle comes to a close. It's Hill's Corps that will be the ones who leads the Confederate Army out of Gettysburg and out of the North, or at least initially. They'll actually trade places along that. A.P. Hill will be the location. I'll kind of back up here. Dorsey Pender gets seriously wounded and will die from his wounds sustained at the Battle of Gettysburg. There'll also be another death in Hill's Corps, which will be Johnston Pettigrew. Hill is at the location when Johnston's Pettigrew gets seriously wounded and eventually dies of the wounds as they're getting ready to cross the Potomac River. The Federal cavalry rush up and attacks the group of officers standing there, and Johnston Pettigrew is killed. So he loses two division commanders like right back to back during the Gettysburg campaign. So a serious blow to him there. That corps, that division will be taken over by Cadmus Wilcox, who's a brigade commander under Richard Anderson's division. So they're switching commanders here a bunch. But now I'm trying to get my head where we're at. Oh, we're coming back from Gettysburg.
Yeah,
and
Gettysburg.
During the fall of '63, there'll be a few engagements, including Bristow Station, which Hill will get his biggest criticism because when Lee moves back into Virginia, George Meade comes after him. Eventually, it's not a pursuit, but he comes after him, and Lee is going to try to alleviate the kind of the pressure on Virginia. So he's going to try to push Meade back, and he does. It's an amazing thing, the Bristow Station campaign. If you ever get a chance to read about it, because Lee outflanks Meade, and Meade is forced to pull back. And so with the vastly inferior army, Lee is able to force the Union Army to run nearly all the way back to Washington, D.C., but A.P. Hill catches an entire corps off guard. And he is going to just destroy them is the plan. And one of his biographers states that A.P. Hill kind of reverts back to division command and doesn't look at the whole picture, and literally does not see the whole picture, because his men get ambushed at the Battle of Bristoe Station, and that huge attack he was planning to push these men all the way into a river basically turns around and bites him, and he loses a countless amounts of men trying to do this horrible attack. And Lee and him will look over the battlefield after the battle has taken place, and they see all the dead bodies. And Lee says, General Hill, bury these men and let us speak nothing else about it. I mean, it's a very serious moment. But from that point on, A.P. Hill does vastly become a better Corps commander, and will kind of later there will be the called the Mine Run campaign. I've also heard it called the Mine Run Battle, a Battle of Mine Run. It's not actually a huge full-scale battle. It's George Meade versus Robert E. Lee, but Lee is going to again attack the flank of George Meade, and A.P. Hill perfectly puts his men on the flank of George Meade, and Meade leaves before A.P. Hill can attack. He pursues, but he's not able to catch George Meade. So Lee is able to thwart Meade twice in Virginia. The next year, of course, Ulysses S. Grant is taking command of the Union Army in the East, or all Union armies, but he's personally overseeing the Army in the East. And A.P. Hill will become one of Lee's chosen Corps commanders. I mean, he's always with Hill, and I don't think at this point it's because Hill needs the guidance. It's more of they are that close of a person. Hill and Lee, and even Hill's wife Dolly, become very, very good friends with Robert E. Lee. Lee visits them regularly, plays with the children. It's a very close-knit group, and Hill and Lee are very close by this point in the war. So I actually put it more towards they've become such good friends, Lee stays with him. But that's just my summation of the facts, or my interpretation of the facts. But when Ulysses S. Grant moves against Robert E. Lee, and what results in the Battle of the Wilderness, A.P. Hill again shows his ability as a Corps commander. He holds off Grant's attacks on the Orange Plank Road, and when his divisions basically get pushed back, there is only me and you have talked about this numerous times, but when his division his divisions of his Corps get pushed back, there's basically only Hogue's artillery batteries again that are between the Confederate Army and near disaster, and A.P. Hill is actually working one of the cannons just like a regular soldier, because he knows the battle is this desperate. So a Corps commander has taken up either the ramrod or the worm of the cannon, and helping to load a cannon to fight off the Union assault against that line, because that Confederate line's nearly getting to break. And right at the right moment, General Longstreet comes up and pushes the Union Army back at that point. Hill is masterfully moving his divisions around the battlefield at the Wilderness. He's just wonderful at it. Now, right after the Battle of the Wilderness, his prostatitis gets even worse, and so he is basically bedridden. He cannot get up. He tries to walk to the next position, which will be the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. He can't make it. Lee tells him, you need to take a break. And so they put Jubal Early in command of his troops. And it's a bitter pill for Hill to swallow, because he's just now getting to understand how to be a Corps commander, and now it's being taken away from him. Early will command Hill's troops through the Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Hill will eventually take back over when they fight at Cold Harbor. Hill will only take kind of 2 sick leaves, and that first one's not even a leave. It's just, hey, you need to take a break, sit out for a little bit. Unfortunately, a large battle takes place, and he has to miss it. And once they get to Petersburg, And around Richmond, it's A.P. Hill who is defending Petersburg against Ulysses S. Grant. And at one point, Hill is supposed to be attacking Grant's forces around Petersburg, and he literally lays down in front of the Union works. Now, it's not right in front, but within viewing distance of the Union works, and has to lay down on his back to relieve the pressure from the prostatitis that's getting so bad. And eventually, Lee will tell him, "Hey, you need a furlough now." And so he spends a week just kind of recuperating. And when he comes back, he knows that something's up. Richmond is going to fall. So he's going to have to get his troops out of there. And it's this is early April. So, it's April, night of April 1st into April 2nd. Hill wakes up and goes to Robert Lee's headquarters very early in the morning. And he tells him and Robert Lee are discussing what's going to be coming up the next day, what's going to be coming up that day. And Hill knows that it's going to be an evacuation. It's going to be coming up fairly quickly. But before they can really get into any of the nuts and bolts of that, one of Lee's staff officers comes in and says the Union Army have broken through our right flank and are coming down the road towards this very headquarters. And so Hill, without being asked, rides off. He knows he's got to find his divisions and he's got to get them moved into the right spot. And so he goes off. He's having trouble finding his divisions. The Union Army have pushed in, and what he doesn't know is he's basically behind Union lines at this point when he's riding with his staff, one staff member. And they come into the clearing, and they look into some woods right across the clearing, and they see some Union soldiers, about 2 Union soldiers over there. They're close enough that they can't really run away. They need to get past them, so they can't run. They have to go towards them, and so they basically say they're going to bluff them, and they go up to the Union soldiers and basically tell them to surrender, that the entire corps is behind them, so you better surrender now. And the 2 Union soldiers do not surrender. They fire their weapons. The man who tries to shoot Hill's staff member doesn't get hit. The man who shoots at Hill, the bullet slices off his left thumb and will hit him right in the heart and kill him instantly. He falls off his horse. The staff officer rides away, tells General Longstreet first. He's the first commander that he runs into on his way back to Robert Lee's headquarters. He will talk to he will tell Longstreet the news, and then he'll break it to General Lee, and General Lee will tell him, go tell A.P. Hill's wife. Dolly is one of the wives of the Civil War generals who stays with her husband the entire war. Unless it's an active campaign, she is right there with him, and she finds some kind of house next to his headquarters and stays with him. And I can't imagine the staff officer having to break that news to her. And
so that's
just
how he died.
Yeah, basically behind Union lines, not realizing exactly where he was. And not that he didn't know where he was. He knew that his troops were somewhere around there, but he didn't know how far the Union had broke into the flank and into the rear. It's not long, about 20 minutes after he's shot, some Alabama soldiers are able to recover his body. They bring it to the house where Dolly is and the children. They load it onto a wagon, a little rickety wagon that they could find. No wheel is the same. Dolly is holding her children in the back of a wagon with her husband's dead body laying there with him. And it's a horrible, horrible thing to think about. That
it is.
It really
is.
Yeah. And Lee tells A.P. Hill's staff officers, take the family north of the Appomattox River and get them to safety. And that's what they do. They take them to a little home on the outskirts of Richmond. Now it's in the city of Richmond, but home just outside the town of Richmond, or city of Richmond. They're trying to find the infrastructure of Richmond is destroyed. There's nothing there. Their businesses are closed up or looted, but they are able to find a pine box. They put his body in it. They have a little ceremony in a local cemetery and put him there. And that's basically the end of A.P. Hill's story. Is he's buried right there, However, Dolly never really forgives the war from taking her husband away. She speaks horribly about the war, the Confederacy. She doesn't like what has happened. I mean, you can imagine. I mean, she lost her husband, someone she loved very, very dearly. And then some gentlemen, some Civil War veterans are like, we'd like to give him a proper burial. Let's try to. The original intention was to bury him next to his mother and father in Culpeper, Virginia, but because the war was being fought, they couldn't get his body up there. So that's why they buried him in that little cemetery on the outskirts of Richmond. Civil War veterans want to give him a proper burial, and so they dig him up, and they bury him in Hollywood Cemetery, which is still a very famous cemetery. A lot of Civil War generals, and Jefferson Davis is buried there. They put him in a spot N35, I believe it is, with no headstone. The only indication that it's him is on the curb. It says Lieutenant General A.P. Hill. He stays there a few years. And then some more Civil War veterans, and one Civil War veteran that is basically wanting to make money. He has an idea to develop a little suburb of Richmond. And what better way to build up that suburb than put a Civil War general there? Literally, put the general there. Because they're putting up monuments. They put up a monument to Jackson. They put up a monument to Lee. They're going to put up a monument to A.P. Hill. Not on Monument Avenue, but in almost like a little subdivision to bring more people there. I know, a little bit morbid, but was the mentality. So they got the permission from Dolly to dig him up again. This is the second time he's been dug up. They dig him up and they bury him underneath his statue in Richmond. And that's where he has remained up until December of 2022. Now, in December, that statue was taken down and the body was dug up. Here on Saturday, as we're speaking right now, January 21st, his body will be reinterred, and it will be in Culpeper, Virginia, the spot he was originally supposed to be buried in when he passed away in April of 1865.
Made quite a journey in death.
He did. He's been dug up 3 times and put in the ground 4, and so this will be the 4th time.
I didn't realize that. That was a very educational lesson there about General Hill. There's a lot of things there I didn't know. I appreciate that. That's very good. Maybe one of the best ones yet.
Well, sorry I ran so long. I didn't. I forget.
Oh no, that's fine. I'll tell you something else we cut too about our times. But no, that was great. I don't have anything else to offer unless you did.
No, I think it went great. Hopefully people want to listen. But yeah, it was A.P. Hill is a fascinating character, someone that I wish more people knew more about. But I hope this video will help people better understand the man that a lot of people have heard of, but very few people know a lot of intimate knowledge of.
Yeah, I've got a lot of. Yeah, I learned a lot from that right there. Well, thanks a lot, my man, and let's try to get together sooner. I know Christmas time and all that. We've had a couple of breaks, but maybe we'll get back on track.
That sounds great. I look forward to it.
All right, man. We'll talk soon.
All right.
Bye.